Welcome. Well, again, we have a great turnout. This is our first presentation in the year 2001. We have a full house tonight, a full house registered for tomorrow night. This is turning into a great success for us. Just to repeat from last month, my name is Chuck Miller. I'm president of the Cleveland Heights Historical Society and a member of the Cleveland Heights Landmark Commission. On behalf of those two bodies, I'd like to welcome everybody here. This is going to be a great presentation this evening and tomorrow night. Just before I get started, I might let everyone know that in the future, if you want to get a flyer so that you can make a reservation a little earlier than we've been able to get the flyers out in the past, please sign up as a member of the Historical Society. We'll be sending flyers out to all the membership. Other than that, the membership, the flyers will be coming out to people on the city flyer that comes out every other month. We'll be posting that. So the thing to do is when you get that in the mail, call right away, get your reservation in. We only have room for about 50 each evening. We have a presentation. We're going to tend to do two every other month. And coming up in March, we're going to have either a presentation about the Shakers in this area and their history, or a presentation from someone revolving around issues and events at the Lakeview Cemetery. So one of those is going to be coming up in March, and then in May we're going to be doing a presentation on Cleveland Heights schools and their history. Tonight we have a presentation by Kara Hamley O'Donnell, one of our own. She is the City of Cleveland Heights Preservation Planner, member of the Planning Department there. Kara has been with the Planning Department since 1995 and is the liaison for our organization at the Cleveland Heights Landmark Commission with the city. Kara has received her Bachelor of Environmental Design and Planning from Miami University. She has her Master's in Historic Preservation and Planning from Cornell University. And as I say, since her graduation in 1995, she's been part of the Cleveland Heights Planning Department. So, without further ado, Kara?
Thank you. We're very, very excited about the great turnout we had tonight, and we're filled tomorrow night, and we have about 40 people waiting for us to set a third date. So we need a bigger schoolhouse, I think. One of my quick announcements I wanted to make, and I made it the last one, so some of you may have heard that already, is that we're doing an oral history project probably in the early spring, where we want volunteers to interview as well as to be interviewed about Cleveland Heights history. We're not talking that you have to be 100 years old. Cleveland Heights history was 20 years ago too, and so we'd like to have a lot of people involved in that. This year is the centennial of the founding of the hamlet of Cleveland Heights, so we thought this was an appropriate time for us to do this. I have a piece of paper over on that table over there, so after the presentation, which should be about 45 minutes to an hour, you're welcome to go sign in that. My business cards are on the back chalk tray if you'd like to grab my card and just call me at the office. I work at City Hall 40 hours a week. I'm here on Tuesday afternoons, but you can reach me best at City Hall. Okay. This year, as we celebrate the centennial of the hamlet of Cleveland Heights establishment, we'd like to take this opportunity to look back at our community before we became Cleveland Heights. While the Cleveland Heights of today is known as a first-ring suburb, a densely developed city of 54,000 diverse people with beautiful parks and unique commercial districts, this area in the 1800s was entirely different. It all began in 1786. I apologize, this slide did not turn out as I wished. In exchange for ceding its claim to western lands, Congress granted 3 million acres in northeast Ohio to the state of Connecticut. In 1795, the state of Connecticut sold the 3 million acres of the Connecticut Western Reserve to the Connecticut Land Company for $1.2 million. The interest of the proceeds were to be used for the Connecticut School Fund, still in effect today. The land company surveyed the property beginning in 1796, adopting a final plan in 1802. This area was divided into a grid of square townships, which were then placed into counties. You can see the map of Cuyahoga County. The city of Cleveland Heights is located in what were the Western Reserve townships of East Cleveland, Euclid, Warrensville, and Newburgh, though the majority is in the former Euclid Township. You can see East Cleveland, Newburgh, and it's difficult to see Euclid is in here, and Euclid and Warrensville. The Cleveland area of the Western Reserve was unhealthy and malaria-ridden, and early population growth extremely slow. Indian populations stayed in the area, though after the War of 1812, Indians gradually vanished from the Western Reserve. Beginning in 1820, the population increased, and immigrants came to the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. While this area developed as a city, eventually to be named Cleveland, the land in which we live was rural territory. You can see in red the area outlined as the city of Cleveland Heights. You can see how densely developed the street network is in the Cleveland area, as well on portions of East Cleveland along what's Euclid Avenue. But our area is pretty much undeveloped. There's a handful of roads in there. You can see Mayfield Road, Taylor Road, Noble Road, Bluestone. And you can see the group. This map is 1892, but this is the closest map I could find to give you a sense of the grid. So even in 1892, we were pretty sparsely developed. And this shows you a map. This is a map of 1852, and I think it's very interesting to sort of see where our community stood at that point. You have them showing an Indian as well as a settler in the same slide. So at that point in the mid-1800s, we were sort of on the verge of becoming a developed area. In 1826, a group of Shakers came to the Heights, the first sizable population to inhabit the area. These North Union Shakers, as they were called the area along the Shaker Lakes the Valley of God's Pleasure. And they lived in a cooperative divided into families, each with different responsibilities. The North and Middle families lived in the southern part of what is today Cleveland Heights, and the Mill and East families lived in Shaker Heights. The group was entirely self-sufficient and raised money by selling their wares and others to the area. They were especially known for their brooms and seeds, though they also produced fruit, vegetables, herbs, canned goods, cheese, butter, pails, casks, churns, yarns, and had quarries and lumber and grist mills. This is near the site of the Shaker Lakes right now, and you can still see the foundations down in the valley under a lot of brush. The city of Shaker Heights, and we're hoping to work with them, are planning on surveying portions of that archaeological. Yes?
Is that the foundation that is just south of North Park on top of Coventry?
Exactly. It's east of Coventry and south of North Park. Just that sort of dead-end parking lot that people call Lover's Lane. It ends into there. If you kind of climb down into the valley, this is a good time of year actually because there's not much brush on the trees. If you go down there, you can see the remains of the foundation of that grist mill.
Actually, if you walk along the sidewalk along Coventry, you can actually look into the brush and see the foundation right from the sidewalk.
Right. Someone's saying that you can look into the foundation from the sidewalk on Coventry.
Incidentally, this grist mill is the one that was next to Roxborough, which replaced the old mill that was right there at Lover's Lane.
Oh, okay. Okay, where was I? Okay. And also the Shakers were noted for their simple yet elegant furnishings. This photograph was taken from a collection they have at the Shaker Museum on South Park Boulevard, and if you haven't had a chance to get there, I would highly recommend it. I went for the first time a couple weeks ago. The Shakers remained in the area through approximately 1889, when their dwindling 27-member celibate society joined with other societies in Ohio and other states. They then sold their 1,366 acres to developers. At the same time, settlers came to the area known as the Heights. Settlers first came to our community in the early 1800s and lived in log cabins and noted a forest of gigantic trees, along with the presence of rattlesnakes and wolves. It is also said that bears, snakes, and wild turkeys inhabited these woods, creeks, and ravines as late as the 1820s. In the 1830s and 1840s, there was a large emigration to the area adjacent to Cleveland, though the area in which Cleveland Heights is located, was one of the last areas to be settled, in part due to its remote location atop a bluff. This is Cedar Hill in 1893, looking downwards. So you can imagine people trying to get up here by horse or on foot. It was a muddy mess, and so they didn't come up to this area very often. People were more apt to settle in areas in Doan's Corners or East Cleveland. And one of the benefits of our area is that people, when they would shop, they had access to these roads. This is Noble Road, and this is Taylor Road. This is Noble Road, and this is Mayfield Road. And as you can see, Mayfield Road led down to Doan's Corners, which was down here, and Taylor Road, as well as Noble Road, led up to Euclid Avenue in East Cleveland. And there was also a railroad there, so that was a great location for the farmers here in Cleveland Heights to sell their wares. Let's see, in 1820, though somewhat isolated, the few settlers were linked via Taylor and Euclid Avenue. And there was also grist mills, tanneries, and factories in Doan's Corners. That was sort of a budding area of the community. Mayfield Road first opened in 1828 as a 6-foot wide dirt road. It's sort of hard to imagine 150 years ago that was the way it was. Though in 1877, the road became a plank road, and it was paved shortly after the turn of the century. So in 1877, it became a toll road, and this is the toll booth that operated the plank road, which was basically planks of wood. And when they would start to get divoted and rotted, they would just flip the planks over. And there was a sort of cottage industry to supply planks of wood to this road, which was very well traveled. 1852 brought the railroad to East Cleveland, and in the mid-1800s, our community was home to hardworking farmers and quarry operators who used the railroad to transport their wares. Later, Superior Road from Euclid to Mayfield opened in 1853, and it wasn't until 1898 that Cedar Road was opened from Euclid to Green Road. I love this. After our new signage on Cedar Road, this is quite different. The few dirt roads provided sometimes treacherous access to the heights, but the area attracted settlers and the lands were good for farming. Unfortunately, the slide didn't turn out too well. This is Grandview, right out in the Cedar Fairmount area in about 1892 or 1893. This is the road, and this is Cedar Road is about here. This house here in the background faces Cedar Road, so you can pretty much tell this sort of looks like it's somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, about 100 years ago. Most of the residents were farmers or farm laborers, though some dealt in real estate. The Taylor family, namesake for Taylor Road, was one of the first families to settle in the area. Mr. Henry and Polly Taylor came from Massachusetts and moved on to Northfield. In 1834, writing from Northfield, Mrs. Taylor wrote a letter to her family back in the East, which characterizes the feelings of a young woman who has left her family and is settling in a new territory. She writes, "I want to know what you are doing this winter. What have you made out of the wool, and have you any flax? Send me pieces of what the family have had since I came away, for I want to see what you wear. Mother, someone comes this way. I wish you would send me a piece of cheese, even if it's a small piece, and a lump of sugar. I don't know but what you will think me a real beggar, and that I ought to be contented with what I have. Although there are difficulties and inconveniences to encounter here, which people do not experience in old settled places, still I have joined myself better than I anticipated." In 1874, the Taylors and their son, Charles Wilder Taylor, purchased property on Superior Road between Mayfield and Euclid Heights Boulevard. Again, Polly Taylor Road. This is a property at Mayfield and Euclid Heights Boulevard, so I think that's just up the street. We have bought this farm of 158 acres. The house is stone, a story and a half. There is a barn, a smokehouse, ash house, a spring house, and an excellent spring of soft water a little ways from the house. We have fruit trees of all kinds, apple, peach, plum, cherry, and quince, some 300 trees, a sugar maple grove of 100 trees, and 60 acres of woodland. We are 6 miles from Cleveland, so we are close to market. In 1849, they sold this property and land was purchased again on Taylor Road, where, according to Polly, we live in a very healthy place. There is no ague as there is in many sections. There are no cases of cholera in the vicinity. We have a very pleasant farm of 122 acres. There are 50 acres of good timber. We have peach, plum, and nectarine trees and a large apple orchard. The thought that they would grow nectarines here just cracks me up. It's hard to imagine a time when the agriculture was the primary use of the land in this community. Another of the earliest settlers were the Miner family. Arriving from New York, William and Naomi Miner purchased property in 1831 and owned 479 acres by 1852. You can see the large extent of the Miner family landowning here. They were one of the largest landowners in the area. For a while, South Taylor Road was called Miner Road because that's where their property was, and the family farmed the land and transported logs to build early railroads. The family raised 10 children, a son named Seth becoming a prominent member of the community. He was a township trustee from 1871 to 73, a Cleveland Heights councilman from 1902 to 04. His daughters Blanche Miner Taylor and Stella Miner Antistale are the namesakes for Blanche and Antistale Roads. Miner Park Lane also honors the family name. Part of their land was also sold to Cleveland Heights for Kane Park and to the school district for Taylor School. Homes tended to be built along the established roadways, and in 1853, Richard Penty settled along Fairmount Road, now called Fairmount Boulevard, farming his land. This home still exists and is a Cleveland Heights landmark. One of the things that I think it's interesting to note, I will be showing a handful of slides of farmhouses that are still here and some that are not here anymore. But one of the most characteristic ways to sort of look at these is being very different from most of the homes in Cleveland Heights, which were built in the 19-teens and 1920s, is they're a very narrow and very tall, very sharp peak, very simple concept, nothing fancy, and oftentimes they have this wing. It's sort of referred to as an upright and wing pattern. Oftentimes, we would think that this part was built first and this was added later. But if you were coming from across, the East Coast and you got here, the idea would be to build something as quickly as possible to get your family covered. You couldn't stay at the Holiday Inn. And so they would build this part first because it was fast and they could live in this part while they built the larger portion of the house. So that's a very common form, and you'll see it repeated throughout most of the farmhouses in the area. Large airing porches were very popular because of the heat, and lots of windows. The windows are very narrow and tall, oftentimes because they couldn't make glass as big as they could make it when houses in the 19-teens and 1920s were built. Oftentimes, you'll have much smaller panes within a window, and that was for the same reason. They couldn't make a large window. They didn't have the technology at that point. So this is the Penty house. Okay, where am I? By the 1870s, Fairmount Boulevard was a well-populated stretch from near Taylor Road to Warrensville Center Road, and had the added benefit of its proximity to the wares offered by the Shakers. You can see here, this is Fairmount along here. There's a lot of names, the Heckers, which was an early landowner, and you can see that there were quite a few houses. Of them, there's only 3 or 4 or 5 maybe of the houses left between Cleveland Heights and Shaker, but it was really its own little community at that point. And this is another picture. You can see its proximity to what would become, this is 1898, so this is a little bit later, but you can see how densely developed this was, and you can see how close it was to the Shaker Lakes. Therefore, these people had access to buying things from the Shakers. There were approximately 15 farmhouses in this mini village, including that of John Hecker, built in 1873, and this is also a Cleveland Heights landmark. Again, you see that very vertical, sharp peaked roof, very simple. And this is a very interesting one because you have this sort of decorative barge board, which is this area up here people often call gingerbread, which was very popular then. Also, this beautiful front storm door, which is original, which you don't have a lot of people who have 150-year-old storm doors. So it's wonderful that that remained. I'm getting ahead of myself. Hold on. Okay. Homes were also constructed along Silsbee, Lee, Warrensville Center, Mayfield, and Noble roads. Of course, those were some of the main roads in the community. You know what? Someone back there push. Wait, let me try this one more time. Wait, now it's doing it. Okay, hold on. My rewind button gets a little stuck sometimes. Okay. And as I was saying, most of the houses were built on main roads. While most of these homes have been lost or significantly altered, the Willard White House on Noble Road still remains and is a Cleveland Heights landmark, which reminds us of our rural roots. And this is, again, the same sort of concept. This is set back on a beautiful broad front lawn, which gives you a sense of what it would have been like when it was surrounded, when none of these houses that were around it were built up. Again, very simple front porch. This form is very, very typical. Another old farmhouse stands on the west side of Noble Road. And several 1890s homes also exist along this busy thoroughfare. This is along Noble Road, and you can start to see as we get into the 1890s, the buildings start to get bulkier. This is definitely not as small and delicate as the early farmhouses. They get taller, they get wider, they just generally have a heavier feel to them. It is notable to observe the foundations on these houses around town. Sandstone foundations were common until about 1910, and that's when tile, block, and brick became more popular. Also, I'll get into a little bit later, stone quarries were prevalent in the area, so it was very easy to come by. Some of these blocks are just huge. I mean, they're usually about a foot or so tall. They can be 5, 6 feet long, and they're a couple feet deep. So these were huge, solid foundations for these buildings. And this is sort of a demonstration of the building we're in right now. It was built with stone. In the 1860s, this home was constructed for the Adams family. It survived by being incorporated into the estate of outbuildings of Elizabeth Severance Allen's Glen Allen estate, just north of Severance Town Center. This Cleveland Heights landmark is located on what's now called Birch Tree Path, but really was sort of in a field by itself. It has been changed some, but it's hard to get a shot of it. But this is the original front gabled portion. A lot of this has been added over time, which isn't uncommon because these houses were so small, and for modern living, people want a little bit more space. James Haycox lived to the south of Superior Schoolhouse. Schoolhouse is right here. It says school. And just south of it was James Haycox. He owned a huge amount of property. He had a quarry there. He had 182 acres. He operated a quarry and a dairy. This is a sketch from an 1874 map that shows his home and his outbuildings. You can see his farmhouse. I'm not sure, this may have been a summer kitchen. Again, a bunch of little farm buildings. Down in here you can see all of his cows for his dairy. Again, the house with some outbuildings. And this is a picture of how the quarry operated.
What would the road be that's fronting on?
I think it may not be a road that exists today. If you look back, well, actually, it was probably Superior. And I'm not sure which of these would have, I'm assuming one of these would have been his house, but it's hard to say if it would have been this one. There could have been a barn, and there's another one down here. So it probably was somewhere along Superior. Am I right? That's Superior. Yeah, that's Superior. No, yeah, this is Superior. This is Superior. Superior kind of goes like this. Right? Well, Superior goes like this. Lee. Well, the school's up here, so yeah, this is probably Lee. Leave it to Chris to ask me a question I can't answer. He opened a sandstone quarry in 1862 on a farm previously settled by Mr. John Welch. It has been believed that the stone for the Superior Schoolhouse was likely quarried from this nearby property because it was just there. So one of the things that I think is interesting, if you get a chance and you're back by the restrooms before you leave tonight, if you look behind the door that leads back into the main door right there, carved into the stone in what would have been the coal room back here in the schoolhouse is the initials A.R. Silsby. And then there's another initials that someone signed in there too. So My guess is that the Silsbys somehow worked on this, or their kids were hanging around when they were working on it. In 1864, just north of Superior Schoolhouse, so that way, John Peter Pryor, a native German who had previously lived in Canton, bought 75 acres of farmland on both sides of Superior Road and moved his family into a sandstone home built in the 1820s, legendarily, there we are, legendarily with Indian labor. This is the oldest standing building in the community. Originally, later on in the late 1800s, the roof was altered, but this frame here of the house is original to the 1820s, and the house actually sits on the ravine and backs up to the park, to Cumberland Park, and it has like a walkout basement. It's lovely, and the people who live it take such good care of it. Okay, where is he? Here's the schoolhouse. Here's Pryor's Lakeview Wine Farm, and his name is J.P. Pryor right there. And this sort of runs what is, this is to kind of orient you, this river is sort of Cumberland Park, Kane Park, down through here, which a long time ago was a ravine with a stream running through it. Pryor planted orchards and set up a cider and grist mills on the stream behind his home and grew vineyards for the Lakeview Wine Farm. While many vineyards simply harvested grapes and shipped them to the market, Pryor actually produced the wine on the site. An 1879 publication stated, quote, "Mr. Pryor's Lakeview Wine Farm is one of the most celebrated wine-producing places in the county." A descendant, who's here tonight, remembered stories of the Shakers picnicking at the Pryor property and of the Pryor children horseback riding on the Shakers property. Pryor died after sustaining a cut while working in his vineyards. His sons, Charles and Emil, went on to be leaders in the community, eventually selling portions of the family property for residential development. You can see Emil Pryor here. This is Superior, and this is a development that took place in the late 1800s, 1890s, called Mayfield Heights. If you're interested in learning more about it, we have some brochures upstairs. And Hearst, I'm guessing that Middle Hearst Road would be named after Mr. Hearst. So you get all these names that you just sort of assume somebody made up. And turns out they were named after somebody. And originally, I'm trying to see, I think it might show on this map. Originally this was called Pryor Road, and now it's Somerton, right? Yeah. In 1867, Hugh Williams constructed this home for his son and daughter-in-law. The home is set in a wooded background and was previously associated with 20 acres. William Quilliams went on to be one of the hamlet's first trustees and a civic leader, and Quilliams Road bears the family name. Again, this has been altered somewhat too, but you get the sense of that front gable, the double windows, and this wing with the porch. This is not a great slide, but it's fuzzy and it gives you the sense of it. Richard Smith purchased land near Ivydale and Mayfield Roads, so around where the U-Haul site is now, and built a home called Brookside. His son, Howard, married Naomi Miner, and they farmed briefly, after which Howard became a contractor. And if you look real closely, it was a bad picture to start with. There's a little pond here, and there's people on the pond. And this is sort of a little beyond the farmhouse ideal here. I think they had some money. And you can see the decorative area in the gable, that gingerbread. There's a fancy little round window here. It's very tall compared to the others we've seen. And it's kind of called a cross gable, where the gables cross each other. So it's sort of interesting to think of that. At that intersection now are car dealerships and a U-Haul. 150 years ago, it was quite different. John Spence also owned land on both sides of Mayfield Road, east of Coventry. His sons, John, William, and Alexander, started the Spence Brothers Construction Company and supplied crushed stone throughout the state, built streets, as well as dealing in real estate. It is said that they had a small railroad which they used to transport stone to the work on the roads. John Spence was on the Board of Trustees for the township, mayor of the hamlet, and later the village, as well as becoming the long-standing member of the school board. Unfortunately, I don't have any good slides of anything from that family. Other important landowners in the area were Peter Rush, who planted vineyards on his land and whose namesake is Rushley Road, and the Comptons owned over 120 acres, the Silsbys more than 200 acres. So again, those names and the streets come back to us. These families were dedicated to the community and to their children's education. They established boards of education and had fundraisers to construct school buildings. As early as 1853, there were 3 schools: Noble School, which is located around where the current Noble School is, and Fairmount Hill School, which was at Fair Hill near Baldwin Reservoir. And people from that section, the Ambler Heights area, Grandview, Belfield, would have attended that school. And of course, Superior School. This is a current slide, but it sort of makes you feel how this place was 100 years ago. It seems sort of like it's in the middle of nowhere. Many of these, this was called Old Number 9 because it was Schoolhouse Number 9. It was in the East Cleveland Township. This was built before Cleveland Heights was Cleveland Heights, and at that point, this section of Cleveland Heights was in East Cleveland. So for a long time, until 1901, when the hamlet was established, we were an East Cleveland school. And many children of the earliest families attended Old Number 9. And this is a photograph from 1891, and it lists all the early names that I've sort of talked about thus far. These schools educated through the 6th grade. Then children attended East Cleveland schools. Many attended Shaw Academy, now Shaw High School. A side note, this church building, Fairmount Methodist Episcopal Church, now called Church of the Savior, they constructed this early religious building in about 1878, which is the site of the schoolhouse's parking lot, so it was right next door. It's been gone for a long time. While most of the families lived a simple, rural lifestyle in this community, 1873 brought the arrival of John D. Rockefeller, sort of sliding off the top of my slide projector. He would be so rude. And he purchased a water cure hotel in what is now Forest Hill Park. This building was existing at the time, and he bought it as a water cure hotel. When the business failed, he turned the hotel into his home, little shack, and named it Forest Hill. He constructed carriage paths, ponds, and bridges, and a golf course on the property, where he would gradually acquire 700 acres of land. John D. Rockefeller owned land throughout Cleveland Heights, and if anyone gets a chance after this presentation, I have several old maps from 1852, 1874, 1892, and 1903 that are overlaid over current maps of the city, so if you're curious about who owned the property you live on, you can look at that. But you'll see John D.'s name scattered all over the city, just little parcels here and there. At any rate, in the late 1920s, his son, John D. Jr., planned the Forest Hill residential development. In 1938, he donated land to Cleveland Heights and East Cleveland for the development of Forest Hill Park. Other people with money in the area, this is a fuzzy slide, were Dr. Nathan Ambler, who had a home just at the top of Cedar Hill, and Ambleside Drive bears his name. Nearby was a ruin of Native American fortification. This was a postcard that was printed in the early 1900s and spread pretty widely, so that kind of gives you a sense of our early roots with Native American fortifications. And his Gothic Revival home was perched grandly at the edge of the heights. His land was sort of on the border of it fell into Cleveland and Cleveland Heights, but you can kind of get a sense of how it was perched up on the hill. I believe the angle this is taken at is that this would be Ambleside, and this is North Park, looking up. There's some other postcards that are out there that show the home, but you see this very vertical, has a Gothic Revival, these sort of pointed arch windows that are often common in churches. Here's another angle of it. Later, the road would be paved, and the land zoned for development of Ambler Heights, also referred to as the Chestnut Hills neighborhood. Later, other elite families, such as the Allens and Severances, would also establish homes in the areas, and that was about the turn of the century. The neighborhood of Chestnut Hills, we're currently working with one of the residents to put on the National Register of Historic Places. It's got a lot of great history and great architecture. And this shows another path leading up, which the postcards have been labeled several ways when I've seen it. I believe this is Fair Hill coming up, but we're not sure. But this gives you a sense of sort of craggly rocks and things that have sort of been softened over the years. Now we've talked about living people at the time. We'll talk a little bit about what they did when they died. While residents sprung up in the area, While this area remained rural in nature, Cleveland's leaders must have seen the future for development in the Heights. In 1869, a group led by Jephthah Homer Wade purchased 200 acres for $73,000 and founded Lakeview Cemetery. The cemetery was designed in the Romantic style, first used in 1831 at Boston's Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is nationally known as a sort of trendsetter for that idea. Lakeview's park-like setting boasted an amazing view of the lake and Cleveland, rolling hills, and beautifully landscaped grounds. One of the ideas behind cemetery development, early cemeteries, the idea was sort of like everything was on a grid, and your family had a plot, and you put a big fence around it, and you separated everybody out. The new thought that started at Mount Auburn and was continued at Lakeview was that things were more open, and it was more of a park-like setting, and you really get that sense when you walk through that cemetery. If anyone has not been through there, that's required in the spring. Lakeview's park-like setting the owners arranged for a streetcar to connect the site to Cleveland. Lot sales were slow, though, because of its then remote location and its elitist reputation. Though when President James A. Garfield's monument was dedicated in 1890, this is a photo that was taken at that time, Lakeview's popularity rose. Many of Cleveland's elite, other than President Garfield, are also buried here, including John D. Rockefeller, Jephthah Wade, Charles Brush, Dr. George Cryle, and the Van Swearingen brothers. It's a beautiful piece of architecture. While residences sprung up in the area, commercial establishments developed simultaneously. Though farming was predominant, quarrying was also very lucrative. In 1867, Duncan McFarland, an Irish immigrant, opened a quarry mining bluestone along the east bank of Euclid Creek. The success of his business led to the establishment of the village of Bluestone, which stretched along Bluestone Road from Quarry Road to the Euclid Creek Valley. The majority of Bluestone was in South Euclid, though there are quite a few remnants of it here in Cleveland Heights. In 1871, two of his sons opened another quarry across the creek, then sold their quarry to the Forest City Stone Company in 1875. About the same time, 1 mile west, the site of Quarry Park, Harry Malone and Robert and John Maxwell, backed by L.E. Holden, opened another quarry. The new quarry was located where Dennison Park is now located, and the work was labor-intensive, and wagons and wheelbarrows were used to transport the stone. Sawmills worked day and night, though they closed in the wintertime. Most of this slide shows you on the edge here is where Bluestone Road is. It was really one of the earliest roads, which, you kind of think of Mayfield, Noble, some of those bigger roads as being maybe the earlier roads, but Bluestone was one of the earliest roads because of its association with the quarries. So again, here it is. You can see the yellow represents frame buildings. While most of the village was located east of Cleveland Heights boundaries, homes associated with Bluestone Village still exist along Bluestone Road. The Asa Cady House, which I've just recently done some research, and it looks as though it was part of the Underground Railroad, which was a very interesting bit of information. And the Schroeder House, located along the 9 Mile Creek, are two Cleveland Heights landmarks. And you can see behind here the 9 Mile Creek that runs behind here. And the creek was used for power for the sawmills. Additional homes and barns still exist both in Cleveland Heights and in South Euclid. You can see this barn behind this house. Another home. You get that same proportion on all these early farmhouses. This one's been changed a lot, but I can get a pretty good sense from the proportions of the roof and the size of the building that it's an early one. Also, you look at those foundations. As soon as you see stone foundations, you figure it's probably somewhere from before the turn of the century or just after the last century, I should say. It's just confusing. You have to retrain yourselves. During the 1890s, Bluestone peaked. 5 quarries operated, and many workers were newly arrived immigrants. By 1910, the bluestone post office closed, and concrete was gaining popularity for use in sidewalks. By 1924, the quarries had filled with water, many later used for dumps, and then filled in and now parkland. The same fate was true for the other smaller quarries which were located throughout Cleveland Heights. Even John D Rockefeller had a quarry on his property at Forest Hill. Lakeview Cemetery had its own quarry, which if you think about it makes a lot of sense for a cemetery. And another existed near the site of Roxborough School. Those are some of the larger ones. They were located all over the community though. We were just talking today about how now sandstone is so expensive, you have to order it from outside of the area, and somebody would just open one of those quarries, we could all have sandstone sidewalks. A growing farming community demanded convenient shopping, and a small outpost had developed near Mayfield and Superior Roads. With the 1877 planking of Mayfield Road, travel along the street increased, and in 1879, William Fair, who would later be the mayor of Cleveland Heights, purchased the general store along Mayfield Road near the site of the old city hall, where he was storekeeper as well as the postmaster of the town of Fairmount, as the area was called. Next to Fair's store was Jacob Schmidt's blacksmith shop, the Spence Brothers Construction Company storage, and the Hawkins Carpenter shop, a real town center at that point. As Mayfield became a Plank State toll road, O.A. Dean Dairy Company, the site of the U-Haul, was established in 1884 by Orville A. Dean. The company began when Orville Dean started selling milk to friends and acquaintances. Dean, an amateur carpenter, constructed this house in 1886, which would serve as a home, dairy, and office until the new building was constructed in 1957. And I have a Dean here this evening. And this is the home that he constructed. This is around the site of the U-Haul. This is the current site of the building. Changed quite a bit. They did build this. The Dean Dairy built this. Early delivery entailed a milkman driving, I'm skipping. This is 3 generations of the Dean family, and this is Grove Dean, who was the last to operate the business when it went out of business in, I think, the 60s. And this is his son, Orville III, who I met with a couple weeks ago, and he lent me a bunch of pictures, and if you get a chance, look at some of those in the showcase back at the back of the room. Early delivery entailed a milkman driving, or I should say riding, his horse and open wagon through the streets, ringing a bell to get the residents' attention. The residents would then come to the wagon with a pitcher where the milk was dipped from a 10-gallon can. The company continued using their prized thoroughbred horses to deliver their milk even after automobiles became common. I was told by Orville III that it was sort of their mystique, and they felt that in the early days of the automobile that the horses were still more reliable than the cars were. And he has tons of awards that these beautiful horses won in horse shows. Soon after delivering his own milk, Dean delivered other farmers' milk, which he collected from throughout the area, going as far as Lake County to collect milk. Then later, he developed into a dairy which handled over 10,000 gallons and supplied milk, buttermilk, butter, ice cream, and other dairy items. By 1890, Cleveland's population had grown to 353,000. That's the city of Cleveland. And the industrial city had become crowded and dirty. Cleveland's elite had developed homes on Euclid Avenue, though they were being pushed further and further east to avoid the city growth. People longed for a home away from the grit and the noise of the industrial city. How did that get in? Okay, there we go. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Heights stood at the edge of the city's development, and the advent of streetcars would make the previously difficult terrain more easily passable. In the early 1890s, residential developers Haycox and Post lobbied for the extension of the Lakeview Cemetery streetcar line to serve their residential development near the town center of Fairmount. This is a terrible slide showing our lovely Cleveland weather. These homes still exist. They're from the late 1890s. They're on the south side of Mayfield Road, just east of Coventry. They sit way up on a rise. And again, you can sort of see their proportions are much more vertical than a lot of our newer homes are. These sort of have a sort of Queen Anne shingle, this one does at least, a Queen Anne shingle effect with this gable being a little more decorative, these little circles. They're very well maintained too. The first interurban line, which would really bring development to the community because that was such a great boon for the area. The first interurban line traveled along Mayfield Road on December 29th, 1899, ushering in the 20th century. In 1892, developer Patrick Calhoun came to the area and developed the Euclid Heights allotment, which was to appeal to Cleveland's elite. He opened the Euclid Golf Club to lure Cleveland's elite to this high-class development. The first 9 holes lay between Cedar and Euclid Heights Boulevard and opened in 1900. He would later sort of lease another 9 holes from John D. Rockefeller, who owned the property just south of Cedar. Contemporaneously, M.M. Brown's Mayfield Heights allotment was underway. We talked a little bit about this before, as was the Walton Brothers Cedar Heights development, which is Grandview and Belfield, both of which were planned to serve the community's more middle-class residents as opposed to the high class that the Euclid Heights allotment strove to move up here. Grandview was named for its lake view, while Belfield was named for Mr. Brockway's nearby pasture, which was inhabited by bell-wearing cows. This was a sketch that was done in the 50s by a man who had grown up here, and you can see here's Cedar, here's Belfield, here's Grandview, here's the cow pasture, here's a rail fence. I mean, it's very specific. Here's woods, here's Doan Creek, which actually is Fairmount Boulevard right about here. He says this is Cedar Heights layout in 1889, I think. And then there was a quarry over here. And you can see that in 1880, this is about 1883, I think, there was only a handful of houses. He even writes the people's names. And that this was a walking path that the kids used to take over to near where the Cleveland Gun Club was. Sort of dangerous walking path. And by 1895, there were only 5 houses on Grandview and 4 houses on Belfield. You can see them right in here. And again, here's the path. This creek is basically where Fairmount Boulevard is. And so you can see this area was pretty much still wide open. This is the Shaker Lakes Park. There was a handful of 1 or 2 of those real large houses near the fire station were here. And but for the most part, Cedar Heights was about it. At the end of the south end of Grandview Road, as I was showing you on that previous map, there was what was called Reeder's Stone Quarry, and this person who drew that map remembered that dynamite blasts were said to have showered stone bits all over Cedar Heights, and that it was very loud between the gun club and the quarries. In response to the impending growth in the area, in 1896, Cedar Glen was widened 300% from its original 10-foot or so path by the Spence Brothers construction, that early Cleveland Heights family. These early residential developments and street improvements would pave the way for unimaginable residential and commercial developments in the 19-teens and 1920s. While most early subdivisions were located in the southwest corner of the city, like this is a home on Grandview. You kind of get a sense that there's really nothing around it. And I love this little girl. I just had to put this picture in. This is from the early 1890s, and I just think things haven't changed too much. In 100 years, little girls still like to play with their little dolls and carriages. She looks very serious, though. While most of the developments were at the southwest corner of the city, just because in the 1890s it was close to a streetcar line, the roads were becoming paved. This one sort of defies sort of the logic of why a lot of the developments were done. This is Woodview Road. And this is one of those streets you'd probably never drive down unless you were going specifically to see someone on Woodview. But if you get a chance, drive down the street. It's really lovely. It's Noble Road. It's right up near the edge of the city. This is the city boundary right up here. And it's this one street here. At that point, it was a block long. It actually now runs all the way down to Monticello. But you can see all of these homes along Noble were there because Noble was a major thoroughfare. So you can kind of see how this developed here, but it's really sort of one in its own on this development. It was originally called Noble Street, and it was developed by Laura M. Stewart nearby the former Rush family property. By 1898, there were 8 simple farmhouses in this development, 5 of which are still existing. I've got a slides of about 4 of them. A lot of them have been changed quite a bit, but you get a sense of their general proportions. And there is, there's still a pretty wooded area. The lots are much bigger than their standard Cleveland Heights lot because it was sort of a more rural development at that point. Another one, this porch has been changed. And another one. This is a really neat one. This is on the Heights Heritage Tour a few years ago. If anyone remembers it, it's set way back from the road. In the late 1890s, the advent of the streetcar would bring an end to the rural life in Cleveland Heights. Population grew, and by 1901, the community formed the hamlet of Cleveland Heights. By 1903, it had become a village. Between 1900 and 1910, once rural areas of Cuyahoga County experienced dramatic growth of over 50%. People were slowly moving from the congested inner city and creating rural enclaves, which would become dense suburban areas. In 1910, our village's population was only 5,000 people. We have no way of knowing really prior to that because the earlier census would have been 1900, and we were still part of all those different townships. So it would take a lot of work to figure out what the population was, but a lot less than 5,000. So you think of 1910 was 5,000. By 1920, the population had tripled to over 15,000. And the roaring 1920s certainly earned their name, bringing unbelievable growth. By 1930, the city's population was almost 51,000. So in 10 years, we went from 15 to 51,000 people. I can just imagine what the 20s were like here. It must have been very noisy with all the construction going on. As you leave this old schoolhouse, my slides. So there's our community there. As you leave this old schoolhouse, imagine what it would have been like to walk out the door, much as a child would have in the 1800s, and see woods, fields, farms, ravines, streams, quarries, and a countryside spotted by small farmhouses, warmed by wood stoves and lit with candles and oil lamps. You might walk a mile or 2 or even 3 to get to your home and then settle in for a warm night. Sounds kind of nice right about now, doesn't it? To me, it's amazing to look back and think in 100 years how much this community has changed. I mean, in the big scheme of things, 100 years is not very long at all. And to think that we went from that to where we are today, I think is just truly amazing. And the 1800s were a very rural time. In the early 1900s, 19 teens and 1920s when things really took off. So I think it's good to look back at our rural roots, but also to appreciate how far we've come. So that's all I have for the slides, and I'd be happy to take any questions about this topic or any other topics you might have. One thing though, because we're tape recording this, because we're going to play it on our cable channel, and so if you have any friends who might be interested, we are going to tape this and play it on our cable channel. I'm going to put a copy at the Cleveland Heights Main Library, which can be checked out too. And since we're taping it, I need to give this microphone to people who are going to ask questions so that it gets on the recorder. Now is everyone going to change their mind?
You had mentioned in passing Euclid Heights development, but you didn't really talk much about it. At least I didn't catch it. Could you comment any more about that?
Yes, that was last month, actually. So I know that there's some of the same faces. A couple months ago, we had a presentation. I talked a little bit about Euclid Heights. Actually, if you get a chance to go upstairs at the end, there's a brochure that talks all about the Euclid Heights subdivision. I happen to know a little bit about it because I wrote a 300-page master's thesis on it. But it was developed and started in the early 1800s, and by about the 1890s, it was starting to take off a little bit, and it was really not until the teens that it started developed. It was developed by Patrick Calhoun, who was, I think, the grandson of Vice President Calhoun, I believe. And he came here allegedly to view the Garfield Monument and fell in love with the property and decided to develop it as a subdivision. He also paid to bring the streetcar up Cedar Hill, which cost him a lot of money. And then all these other guys, like the Mayfield Heights, which is that area just on the other side of Coventry, and the Ambler Heights, which was just south of him, and the Grandview Belfield, really made out pretty well because he brought utilities and the streetcar up the street, and they didn't have to pay for it, and they reaped the benefits, and he went bankrupt in 1913. And so his dream for these huge houses, which there are a handful of in the subdivision, was sort of changed. And in the 19-teens and 1920s, apartment buildings, our commercial districts were built there, and it changed dramatically into family houses, which he just wanted these huge houses for the very elite of Cleveland. But just so you know, upstairs, and if you can't get upstairs and you need someone to bring the brochures down, I usually have them down here. There are brochures about, it's a walking tour of the Mayfield Heights subdivision, a walking tour of Euclid Heights. It specifically targets the apartment buildings in the district. Another walking tour which targets bungalows on the north side of the city, and another walking tour that targets two-family homes along Meadowbrook. So if in the spring you're looking for something to do, those are all available upstairs.
Does the Calhoun House still stand on, I think, on Edge Hill?
Calhoun had two houses, actually. His first summer home still exists, and it is on Edge Hill, and it's a Cleveland Heights landmark. And we have if anyone's interested, we do have landmark booklets that talk about all the landmarks. Those are available at City Hall. But it's a sort of arts and crafts. It has a stone wall around it. It's on the south side of Edge Hill. He also had a huge Italian palazzo that is about where, I want to say Bethel Baptist on Cedar Road. Is that more modern church on the, it's a very large church on Cedar Road. That was demolished, but he also, the carriage house for that house still exists there.
One other thing, when we moved to Cleveland Heights in 1939, the quarry, one of the quarries was still cutting stone, I remember. They chased kids away, but they still had some massive machinery. And this was, I think, on the site where the South Euclid repair garage is now, the vehicle repair garage.
So it would have been within the Bluestone Village area.
Yeah, in that area.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you know, when the concrete and the cement came along, it pretty much killed most of that industry, though there must have still been some demand with it. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
The sandstone sidewalks were very slippery.
Yes, and when you leave here, be very careful, because we did put a sandstone sidewalk on the front door, and it is very slippery.
I have a question for you on landmarks. The Wheeler House, of course, was the first house. I think it was 1824 or 1832 it was built.
Sometime in the 1820s.
Very early. There were still bears around and all. But right next to it, the house where most of the Pryors grew up, the White House on the corner next to Wheeler's, probably should also be considered for a landmark, because that goes way, way back.
We actually talked about that about a year ago or so. That is, and the reason he knows this is because he's a Pryor. Yes, if you, when you're leaving here, if you are traveling north on Superior Road, look to your right, and that is the Pryor house that I showed you, that stone house it's the oldest house in the city. And it's a beautiful house, and right just past that is a large white house, and that's the other Pryor house he's talking about.
Yeah, I just think that, I know that though most of the Pryors grew up in there, Alvin Pryor and my whole family, mother and her sisters. And that, I think, was about 1871 or 1872 that was built, because the stone house was too small.
Well, it's quite small.
At least that's what my mother used to tell me.
Interesting.
Well, I spent 5 years on Pryor and played with Al Pryor. He was called. I've got pictures of Al and myself from when I was 2 years old till I was 7. So, and I went in the farmhouse many, many times. I remember it. So you...
That must have been Al Jr.
That's Al Jr.
And he was called Junior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alvin's old house is still, Uncle Alvin's home is still kitty corner across from the Wheeler house. And so that's still in good shape.
We should all applaud Miss Becker. She's an alumni of Superior Schoolhouse.
Someplace I heard that when the Baldwin Reservoir was built, the stone that was excavated from the ground there was brought over and dumped into a quarry at the site of the Roxborough School by a railroad.
You are right.
Is that correct?
Yes, in fact, I wonder if he's here tonight. I have a person who's very, very interested, Mr. Stewart, and I'm trying to remember what descendant family. He's descended from one of the early Cleveland Heights family, and I'm blocking on which one. He lives in Shaker. And he's been doing research on that, and very, very diligent research, going down to the Cleveland Water Department to find information about when that was built, because there still is sort of the foundations from that railroad, which goes across the Shaker Lakes Park, down in the vicinity of Roxborough School. And he went down, he found drawings from when they were building Baldwin Reservoir, and that showed a railroad line, but it didn't go into the city of Cleveland Heights, it just sort of stopped. And he's determined to find a map that shows it. But I think it's pretty safe to say, and he actually found some old photographs showing the contractors moving the earth, because there had been a quarry where Roxborough School was, and they needed to fill the quarry, and Baldwin Reservoir needed to get rid of some fill. So it was a very temporary kind of railroad that went just for that purpose, to go back and forth and fill, so they could build the school there eventually.
Could you give me that man's name later?
Yes, you know what? If anyone asks me a question, I say to get back with me. Right at the very back near the light switch on that chalk tray are my business cards. Grab one of those, and I can put you in contact with him, because at our last presentation, he and another man started talking. So I'll get all of you together, and you can give us a presentation maybe in a year or so.
Do you have any information about the steel structure homes on Monticello Boulevard?
I don't know the Lustron homes. Lustron was the name of the company, and I have minimal information on the Lustron homes in general, but I don't have any specifically on the ones along Monticello Boulevard, though I've been told by people that those were Lustron homes, but I don't.
How do you spell lustrum?
Lustron, Lustron.
Lustrum.
I think I may have a file at the office, so if you want to try to give me a call, I can look into it. You may be able to find something on the internet, because there's a lot of people who are Lustron groupies.
Are they sort of late 20s?
Oh, I'm sorry. Lustron homes were homes that were built out of steel. It was sort of, it was in the 1920s.
Well, that's what I'm asking you.
I'm not
think
sure
so.
exactly when it was, but it was sort of this new age thing. Everything was out of metal. The inside cabinets were out of metal. The walls were out of metal. I mean, that was the new thing. It was a very short-lived phase, however. Well, I thank everyone for coming tonight. Now, before you leave, there's a guest book if you'd like to sign out, because I keep telling people when they come back here in 50 years or 5 years, they'll see their names, and I love it when little kids sign in here, and I tell them in 50 years you can come back here and see your name. Also, I've got maps up here, and I'm going to put them on the chalk trays, but from 1852, 1874, 1892, and 1903, which are overlaid over current Cleveland Heights maps, so you can see if you live on former Silsby property, or who owned your property 150 years ago. Also, there's brochures upstairs. I have a slideshow running on the computer upstairs of old Cleveland Heights photos from the 19-teens and 20s, and you can tour upstairs, and you can look at the Silsby name signed on the stone in the back room. You can leave out the back door or the front door, but it's sort of longer to get if you parked over at Cumberland this way, but be careful on that sidewalk out front, too. Do you have anything else to say, Chuck?
Kara, thanks so much. Great, great presentation. I think she deserves a good round of applause. Let me give my 2-cent plug. Anybody who's not a member of the Historical Society can pick up an application form over here and take it with them and mail them in to us. We love to have members. It's really cheap to join, $15 for a family membership, $10 individual. It helps us a lot in keeping programs going and getting publicity out about these events. We want to grow now that we have a sort of a home to make presentations in, and we want to commit ourselves to a good quality presentation every 2 months, and Kara did a great, great job this time. Thanks everybody for coming.